The moon has no atmosphere, no magnetic field, no water, no shelter from the sun's radiation or the absolute cold of space. During the lunar night, which lasts 14 Earth days, surface temperatures plunge to minus 170 degrees Celsius. During the day, they soar to plus 127 degrees. The difference between these extremes is nearly 300 degrees. For the 12 men who walked on the moon between 1969 and 1972, survival depended entirely on engineered habitats, the lunar module, and the pressure suits sealed around their bodies. There was no room for error, no backup from Earth, no rescue if systems failed. Every thermal seal, every battery cell, every layer of insulation had been calculated to keep human tissue alive in an environment designed to destroy it. This is the story of how astronauts survived the moon's brutal extremes and how close they came to not surviving at all. The Apollo lunar module was not designed for comfort. It was designed for minimum weight and maximum function. 2 astronauts lived inside a pressurized cabin, barely larger than a telephone booth, standing for most of their time on the surface because there were no seats. The walls were aluminum alloy, thin as foil in places, backed by layers of mylar insulation to reflect radiant heat. The cabin maintained pressure at 5 pounds per square inch, roughly 1/3 of Earth's atmosphere, using pure oxygen. Outside, the vacuum was absolute. A single puncture would have been catastrophic. The astronauts knew this. They moved carefully. They spoke in measured tones. They did not allow themselves to think about what would happen if the hull failed, because there would be nothing they could do. Decompression would take seconds. Consciousness would last perhaps 15. Death would follow shortly after. Thermal control was the lunar module's greatest engineering challenge. On the sunlit surface, temperatures climbed above 100 degrees Celsius. In shadow, they dropped below minus 100. The module had no active heating system for its exterior. It relied on passive insulation, multiple layers of aluminized mylar, separated by vacuum gaps, reflected heat back toward its source. This kept the sun's energy from cooking the interior during the day. At night, the same insulation prevented the module's residual warmth from radiating into space. But it was not perfect. The crew compartment required active temperature regulation. A system of water glycol coolant circulated through metal plates beneath the cabin floor and around critical electronics, absorbing excess heat. That heat was then expelled through sublimators, devices that vented water vapor into the vacuum, cooling the fluid before it cycled back. The system worked, but it was not forgiving. If the sublimator clogged, temperatures inside the cabin would rise. If the glycol leaked, the system would fail entirely. The astronauts carried no spares. They had no way to repair a breach in the coolant loop. They simply trusted that it would work. The moon's surface conducted heat with brutal efficiency. Lunar regolith, the fine dust covering the surface, acted as an insulator in vacuum. But where it contacted metal, it transferred temperature directly. The lunar module's landing pads rested on this regolith. During the day, the pads absorbed solar heat. At night, they radiated it away. Engineers designed the structure to minimize conduction, using lightweight struts and keeping the cabin elevated above the surface. But the astronauts still felt the cold. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, during Apollo 11, reported uncomfortably low cabin temperatures after their single extravehicular activity. The environmental control system struggled to maintain 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The astronauts slept in their pressure suits, which provided additional insulation, but sleep was difficult. The cabin was noisy. The glycol pumps hummed. The oxygen fans whirred. The radio crackled intermittently with static. Armstrong later described it as the least restful night of his life. He did not complain. Complaining would have served no purpose. The pressure suits were the astronauts' true habitat. The A-7L spacesuit, used during Apollo missions, was a self-contained life support system. It had 14 layers. The innermost was a comfort layer of nylon. Then came a pressure bladder of neoprene-coated nylon, which held oxygen at 3.7 pounds per square inch. Around that were multiple layers of aluminized mylar and dacron, providing thermal and micrometeorite protection. The outermost layer was Teflon-coated beta cloth, a fiberglass fabric designed to resist abrasion and reflect solar radiation. The suit weighed 80 pounds on Earth. On the Moon, it weighed 13, but it was still cumbersome. Movement was restricted. Bending at the waist required effort. The gloves were stiff, making fine motor tasks nearly impossible. The astronauts trained for months to perform simple actions while suited. On the surface, every motion burned calories and consumed oxygen. They had to pace themselves. Fatigue was dangerous. Exhaustion could lead to mistakes. Mistakes could lead to torn gloves, punctured suits, or broken seals. Any of these would have been fatal. The portable life support system, worn as a backpack, regulated the suit's environment. It supplied oxygen at a rate of 6 pounds per hour. It removed carbon dioxide using lithium hydroxide canisters, which absorbed the gas through a chemical reaction. It cooled the astronaut's body using a liquid cooling garment, a network of thin plastic tubes sewn into an undergarment, through which chilled water circulated. The water absorbed body heat, then passed through a sublimator identical to the one in the lunar module, venting vapor into space. The system provided roughly 7 hours of life support. When the oxygen ran low, or the lithium hydroxide saturated, or the water depleted, the astronaut had to return to the lunar module or die. There were no extensions, no second chances. Apollo 14 astronauts Alan Shepard and Edgar Mitchell pushed their consumables to the limit during their second moonwalk, returning to the module with less than 10 minutes of oxygen remaining. They did not speak of it as reckless. They called it maximizing mission objectives. The distinction was thin. Radiation was invisible, but constant. The Moon has no magnetosphere. Cosmic rays and solar particles strike the surface unimpeded. During solar flares, radiation levels spike. Exposure can cause acute sickness, cellular damage, and long-term cancer risk. The Apollo missions were timed to avoid major solar events, but prediction was imperfect. The astronauts accepted the risk. The lunar module's thin aluminum hull provided minimal shielding. The spacesuits offered none. Radiation passed through them as if they were paper. On the surface, astronauts absorbed approximately 1 millirem per hour, roughly 50 times the background radiation on Earth. During a solar flare, that rate could increase 100-fold. Apollo 16 launched during a period of heightened solar activity. Commander John Young and lunar module pilot Charles Duke spent 71 hours on the Moon. They were fortunate. No major flare occurred. If one had, they would have received a dose sufficient to cause nausea, vomiting, and immune suppression. They would have continued the mission. Abort was not an option unless incapacitation was immediate. Sleep on the Moon was an engineering afterthought. The early missions had no provisions for it. Armstrong and Aldrin slept standing in their suits, leaning against the cabin walls. Later missions included hammocks slung across the cramped interior of the lunar module. The hammocks were thin nylon fabric. They provided no cushioning. The astronauts described them as barely better than standing. Sleep cycles were short, typically 4 to 6 hours, interrupted by suit adjustments, radio checks, and the persistent discomfort of confinement. The cabin temperature fluctuated. The oxygen system dried the air, causing nasal irritation and sore throats. The astronauts wore communications carriers, tight-fitting caps with built-in microphones and earphones which pressed into their scalps. They could not remove them without losing contact with mission control. Some astronauts removed their helmets to sleep. Others kept them on. None slept well. Fatigue accumulated. By the third day on the surface, reaction times slowed. Mistakes increased. The astronauts pushed through. They had no alternative. Water was scarce. The lunar module carried approximately 40 pounds of water for drinking and rehydration of freeze-dried food. The crew could not waste it. They could not bathe. They could not clean their suits. Lunar dust infiltrated everything. It clung to fabric with static electricity. It abraded seals. It coated visors, reducing visibility. It smelled, the astronauts reported, like spent gunpowder. It irritated their lungs when inhaled. The dust was a constant problem. Engineers had underestimated its pervasiveness. On later missions, crews developed techniques to minimize contamination. Brushing suits before re-entering the module, sealing sample bags carefully, avoiding unnecessary movement inside the cabin. But the dust remained. It was unavoidable. Harrison Schmitt, the geologist on Apollo 17, suffered an allergic reaction to it, experiencing sneezing and congestion that persisted throughout the mission. There was no treatment. He continued working. Power was finite. The lunar module ran on batteries. 2 silver zinc batteries provided electrical power for the ascent stage, where the crew lived. A third powered the descent stage, which was abandoned on the surface. The batteries could not be recharged. Once depleted, they were dead. Engineers calculated power budgets down to the watt-hour. Every system drew current. Oxygen pumps, cooling fans, communication radios, instrumentation displays, cabin lights. The astronauts were trained to minimize usage. They turned off non-essential systems. They dimmed lights. They spoke briefly on the radio. On Apollo 13, after the explosion in the service module, power conservation became desperate. The crew powered down the lunar module to preserve battery life, shutting off heat, light, and most electronics. The cabin temperature dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Condensation formed on the walls. The astronauts shivered. They breathed in clouds of vapor. They did not complain. Complaining consumed oxygen. They focused on survival. The batteries lasted. Barely. Communication with Earth was delayed. Radio signals took 1.3 seconds to travel from the moon to mission control. Responses took another 1.3 seconds to return. In an emergency, this delay was potentially fatal. If an astronaut fell, or a suit ruptured, or a system failed, mission control could not provide immediate assistance. The crew had to solve problems in real time, alone, with whatever resources were at hand. Training covered contingencies. Checklists provided procedures. But improvisation was sometimes necessary. Apollo 12 Commander Pete Conrad noticed his suit's oxygen flow decreasing during a moonwalk. He suspected a clogged filter. Without waiting for mission control's input, he increased the flow rate manually, bypassing the regulator. The suit stabilized. Conrad continued the EVA. Mission Control learned of the issue only after he reported it as resolved. They approved his decision retroactively. There was nothing else they could have done. The ascent from the moon was the most critical phase. The lunar module's ascent engine had to ignite. It had to burn for approximately 7 minutes. It had to place the crew into a precise orbit for rendezvous with the command module. There was no backup engine, no second attempt. If the ascent engine failed, the astronauts would remain on the moon until their oxygen ran out. They would die within hours. The engine used hypergolic propellants, Aerozine 50 and nitrogen tetroxide, which ignited on contact. No spark plugs, no ignition system, just chemistry. It was elegant. It was also unforgiving. Contamination could prevent ignition. A fuel leak could cause an explosion. Engineers tested the engine extensively, but testing on Earth could not replicate lunar conditions. The astronauts trusted it because they had no choice. Every ascent engine ignited successfully. Every crew returned to orbit. This was not luck. It was engineering discipline, redundancy, and the narrow margin between life and death that defined human spaceflight. The Moon does not forgive. It offers no second chances, no shelter, no mercy. The astronauts who walked its surface survived because engineers calculated every risk, because systems functioned within razor-thin tolerances, and because human beings endured discomfort, fear, and isolation without breaking. They lived inside machines, surrounded by vacuum, subjected to temperature swings that would shatter steel, and they performed tasks that demanded precision under conditions designed to kill them. The habitats that kept them alive were marvels of engineering, but they were also fragile. A single failure, a single miscalculation, a single moment of inattention could have ended everything. The astronauts knew this. They accepted it. They climbed into their pressure suits, sealed their helmets, and stepped onto a world where survival was never guaranteed. They returned not because the Moon allowed it, but because human ingenuity, preparation, and will refused to yield. That is the cost of exploration. That is the price of reaching beyond Earth. And that is why, 50 years later, we still look to the Moon and remember what it took to survive there.